This week's video is about a game that was requested by a subscriber. And it's a game that was extremely silly and targeted at little kids and goofy people. But it was also a game that was very sophisticated and targeted toward adult strategy gamers. An interesting case of split personality. Going down the rabbit hole. Research for this game has led to a warren. That's a bunch of rabbit holes, interconnected and maze-like. An appropriate metaphor. The game requested is All the King's Men, a Parker game that was released in 1979. But of course there's more to the story than just that. My cousin Ben and I were in the chess club back in high school. This was about 1970. Yes, I'm that old and was that nerdy. We played a bunch of different strategy games besides just chess. My cousin Ben came across a game that was called Smess. The subtitle was Ninny's Chess. It looked appropriately goofy, so we gave it a shot. It was silly and juvenile, but I wish I had it yet today. It was a Parker game, and it was designed by Perry Grant and Reuben Klamer. Now, Reuben Klamer was a designer, quite prolific designer, mostly for Milton Bradley. But anyhow, the Smess game looked like this. A crazy quilt of cartoon squares pointing every which way, and silly little cartoon characters for the playing pieces. There were 3 types of pieces set for each player: the ninnies, the numbskulls, and the brains. Now apparently this game was pretty successful for Parker. It was published in English, it was published in German, it was published in Spanish, and it was published in French. And oddly, one version that was published in the UK by Miro was called Take the Brain, rather than calling it Smess. I'm not sure why, whether the word Smess had some sort of euphemistic meaning in the UK that I'm not aware of, but at any rate, that's what they called it. So now let's fast forward to 1979, and the folks over at Parker decided to resurrect this game called Smess, but they gave it a complete makeover, and this is what they came up with. This game is called All the King's Men, and I'm sure a lot of you are more familiar with that than you are Smess. But it turns out that the core of this game is exactly the same as Smess. Et voila, the new game. The ninnies and numbskulls are replaced by archers and knights, and the brain is replaced by the king. The board is decorated with scenes of chivalry and knightly deeds, crusaders, I suppose. Now it's all very colorful and historic looking in a 1970s sort of a way, but theme means everything to the mass market, and I guess that's where they were coming from when they put this together. But at its core, it's a pretty good game, even with the ninnies. Okay, so the pieces are set up like you see here. We've got a row of archers, we've got the king flanked by a couple of knights, and they're standing on the edges of a labyrinthine mass of arrows every which way. As you can imagine, all the pieces move according to these arrows. The archers move just one space at a time according to the arrows. The kings, likewise, move just one space per turn according to the arrows. The knights, however, can move as far as they want. It's sort of like the rook of the game, and their movement direction is based on the square that they're departing from. And any piece can capture any piece. There's no ranking as far as the power of the piece to capture another. So the archer can capture the king can capture the knights, etc. And the objective is, as you might suspect, to capture the opposing king, and therefore take the field. But as a sort of an homage to chess, it's required of a player that when the opposing king is essentially in check, is going to be taken in the next turn, they're supposed to point at it and say, threat, and then that gives the opponent a chance to escape from that threat. Maybe a little bit contrived, but it's kind of a necessity in a game of this kind of magnitude. Now, tactically, you can play this game so it's sort of a fight, freeze, or flee type of reaction to whatever's going on around you. But once you've played the game for a while and you get used to the direction of these arrows and the balance of the board, you can start to develop a strategy so that there's a little bit more behind your moves than just simply reacting to the opponent's play. Now, here on the board, we're a few moves into a game, and you sort of see how things progress as we pile into the field here. I've got a couple of knights here that have ventured into the opponent's half of the board. A little exploratory stuff going on here with the archers. The king over here is about ready to make his escape into the fray, or maybe to take a little refuge in the corner. Who knows? I mean, it depends on your strategy. And there's way more strategy than a game like Smess would convey in the artwork and the silly characters. Now let's just push this aside a minute. I want to talk about the rabbit holes. It was kind of a wonderland adventure to look into this game and kind of look around and see what influences it may have had over the years, and to look at some other games that are similar. And so I definitely ventured down the rabbit hole a little bit here. The first rabbit hole, games with arrows. So let's start out with a quick ride in the Wayback Machine, and we'll go back to 1945 in New Jersey. The famous card shark John Scarney had begun inventing board games, and his company had just released a game with an extremely creative name, Follow the Arrow. The game he called America's Most Fascinating Game was hardly that. Mr. Scarney was known for his self-promotional hyperbole. Basically, the game was Reach the Other Side game, a game of transference. It was unique enough to be granted a patent in 1948, but it didn't break any sales records. It did continue to be published as late as 1964, in this version here. But in common with All the King's Men, all the arrows on the board were public knowledge, and they were well thought out and well balanced. But there was some real strategy behind the game, even though on the surface it was kind of juvenile looking. So, rabbit hole number 2. This is kind of a competitive maze look to it. You're finding your way around these arrows as if they were corridors within a maze. So that brings to mind a host of other games that do that sort of thing. Now, some of these mazes are set up as part of the gameplay. For example, Corridor, Got 'em, Tsuru, Cardboard. Some are printed right on the board. Pac-Man, Dungeon, Robo-Rally, Clank. And some of these mazes are partially modifiable. For example, Amazing Labyrinth, Conveyor Belt, Double Trouble. Now, in 1972, a company called Aladdin published a game called Triples with a whole bunch of P's in the middle of it. And it looked a lot like this on the surface. You had little squares with little arrows pointing every which way. But in that case, you had the ability to move those arrows around and change the direction of them and such. Triples was patented in 1974, and I thought I had Triples in my collection, but I know I've played it once or twice. But All the King's Men isn't really a maze, and it's not modifiable. Other games with directional spaces on them seem to rely real heavily on chance as a major factor of the movement. That goes way back to ancient India, as a matter of fact, where we find the roots of the game that we all know as Chutes and Ladders. It was later brought to the UK in the 1890s as Snakes and Ladders. At some point it was softened a bit for sensitive American youth. That's where we get the name Chutes and Ladders. Now, speaking of American games, Milton Bradley's Checkered Game of Life in the 1860s used dice to move, and printed instructions for further movement were scattered around the board. In fact, all the hazard spaces on all the Uncle Wiggily games are sort of like this. Land here and this happens. But All the King's Men is not random, so we can exit this rabbit hole. Now, I did find a little bit of a mystery in that Board Game Geek's database actually lists Milton Bradley as being one of the publishers of this game. I have not found any evidence anywhere else of that fact, if that's a fact. If you know something about that, let me know. So, All the King's Men, it's a great little game. I definitely encourage you to give it a try. And if you get real generous and you have a copy of Smess laying around, just pop it in the mail to me. I wouldn't mind a bit. So let's crawl up out of those rabbit holes now and get back to the real world, as much of a real world as game playing can be. And be sure to play every day. Oh, and by the way, Alice never did crawl out of that rabbit hole.